What is a vacation? A slice of time, a peace of mind, a break, an escape, that need you want. It's the place you dream of. It's paradise. It's romance. It's choices. All included, all unlimited. Forget what you left behind. Live the now. No schedules, all desires. Night falls, day breaks, you wake up beautiful. Different, connected. Two hearts, one soul. This is the time of your life.
So for today's video, I'm gonna help you guys decide on a destination between either the Dominican Republic or Cuba. The reason why I wanted to do this video is because the two are often very well compared, and they are very comparable at the same time. Both destinations are known to have relatively good value, obviously good beaches, good weather, but there's always a little bit more that I think could help you personally decide on where you want to go. At the same time, I'm also trying to convince myself where my next destination vacation is going to be. So what I'm going to kind of do here is pick out the pros and cons of both destinations. To give you a little bit of background, I do travel a lot. I've been to the Dominican Republic probably in and around somewhere between 10 and 12 times. I've been to Punta Cana, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Plata. To Cuba, I've actually only been about 4 times. So I've been to Varadero twice, and I've been to Cayo Santa Maria twice. Both are excellent destinations, but they do kind of offer different things. Now, number one about the Dominican Republic, this is definitely a huge pro. I have to say the food differences. Food on most resorts in the Dominican Republic, you'll find are a lot better than what you'll find in Cuba. Now, when it comes to Cuban food off the resort, excellent. You're gonna find some amazing things. On the resort, to be honest with you, it's a little bit hit or miss. You'll find in a lot of the a la carte restaurants that the food in the Cuban resorts are actually quite good, whereas what you'll find in the buffet can be very bland. They don't use a lot of spices, and their meat selection is just honestly, it's not very good. Most of the time you'll find beef or chicken that's very, very tough. Now, if you like seafood or you like things like pork, now you'll find a good variety in Cuba yourself. Now, when it comes to the Dominican Republic, about their food, because the resorts are very Americanized, they generally have a great selection, you know, good variety of different things, whether it's for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The last place I went to was the TRS Turquesa, and the food there was just fantastic. Great variety on that one specific resort. But then I went over to the other resorts and I found the food wasn't as good. That is definitely a huge pro for a lot of people, especially if you're very picky when it comes to what you eat. You'll definitely like the Dominican Republic a lot better. If you're not that picky, then Cuba will be just fine for you. If you can live off French fries for about 1 week straight, go to Cuba. Now, to compare the weather between the two countries, Dominican Republic is generally very hot all the time, all year round. Especially during the summer, you're gonna find 30 degrees plus. I remember there was one summer we went, I think it was in August. We went to the Bahia Principe, and honestly, it was even too hot for the Dominicans. Pro/con when it comes to Cuba. If you don't like super, super hot weather, you may want to choose Cuba, except during the summer, because it's 30 degrees plus during the summer in Cuba all the time. If you go during October, November, during Christmas time, January, February, it's generally cooler. You'll find 20 degrees plus weather. There was one time we went to Cayo Santa Maria, and there was one day when it was like 19 degrees. And because of the fluctuations, the day before it was like 26, 27. The 19 degrees in the shade felt so cold. Another huge pro I find for the Dominican is they do offer free Wi-Fi generally on every resort now, wherever you go. Same thing goes for Jamaica, but we're obviously not talking about Jamaica right now, which is definitely a cool added bonus if you like to stay connected with, you know, people you know back home, if you want to be able to make free phone calls through Skype or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, whatever it is that you want to do. The Dominican has that, and it's generally an offered feature that's already included in the package that you pay for. Now, Wi-Fi in Cuba, sucks. The internet there is really bad. The reason why is because their systems are so far behind that they just can't keep up. And generally the Wi-Fi on Cuban resorts, I have yet to even hear about one or find one that actually offers free Wi-Fi throughout the resort like the Dominican Republic does. Generally you have to pay, I think it's between like $5 and $10 for 1 hour just for Wi-Fi in any Cuban resort generally. Another huge pro, generally in the Dominican Republic you'll find that the resorts are very modernized, whereas in Cuba they're very old-fashioned. They haven't been renovated in probably 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. Last resort that I went to in Cuba, let me tell you, that place was definitely hasn't been touched probably since the 60s or 70s. But generally when you go to the Dominican Republic, majority of the resorts are very modernized, have, you know, the rooms look like they would back at home in North America, whether you be from Canada or the US. The rooms are generally very comparable. The resorts are very comparable to what they actually have here. Whereas in Cuba, you don't see them renovating that often. The most modernized resort that I found in Cuba was in Varadero. It was called the Royalton Hicacos. We stayed there for 1 week. We found that the resort was very nice. However, when you went into the rooms, it was very old-fashioned. They haven't been renovated in probably 20 years, which is generally, so considering it's a very high-end resort for Cuba, and it also used to be a sandals. So if you go to Cuba, don't expect an extravagant-looking resort. Most of them are probably not. Now this is a huge pro for both countries. If you're a history buff, for example, in the Dominican Republic you have Santo Domingo. You'll find a lot of old castles. They have a huge building where they supposedly say Christopher Columbus is buried. Nobody knows for sure whether he's buried there or Sevilla, but it is generally really cool. I went when I was about 7, I think I was, and I found it was very interesting. They have a lot of old historical things. Dominican Republic was one of the first islands ever discovered by Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean, so that was pretty cool. History, obviously, in Cuba, you have Havana, right? A lot of people, I've personally never been to Havana yet. I will go in the future one day, but everybody that I've ever spoken who have been to Havana have said it's amazing. It's like a world in and of itself. Like it's so cool. The buildings are so historical. There's so much to see. The people are generally nice, and you'll get a lot of that in Cuba. Another huge thing to compare is the variety of resort options that you have available. In the Dominican Republic, you have a huge range of resorts. So you have anywhere from low-end, cheap resorts to very, very high-end resorts, you know, consisting of $20,000 a week, for example. In Cuba, you won't have that at all. It's very, very hard to find. They generally only have maybe about 2 or 3 resorts that are considered relatively high-end, and to be honest with you, they're not even high-end resorts. They're high-end Cuban resorts. So don't expect anything massively extravagant. Even if you pay the highest price in all of Cuba, you probably won't get anything super extravagant. Whereas in the Dominican, you have that option. If you go to places like Puerto Plata, you'll find a lot of more value hotels where things are not as extravagant, but you also won't pay an extravagant price. You might only pay $1,000 per person for a week. Whereas in Punta Cana, you'll find a lot of mid to high ranging resorts where you'll get a lot of more extravagant things. Things will be a lot more modernized, the food will be better, that sort of thing. My personal preference when it comes to the Dominican Republic, I've been to Puerto Plata once. I find that a lot of the resorts are not very good. I don't like the food on most of those resorts. Where the beach is located for those resorts, honestly, it's not the same as Punta Cana. Punta Cana is probably the #1 destination in all of the Dominican Republic. So my suggestion, if you're going to the Dominican Republic, spend the extra money, go to Punta Cana. Another cool thing I find about the Dominican Republic is the fact that you can buy property there. So you can buy a beautiful beach house, you can buy a condo. There are a lot of those types of options if you actually want a vacation house in the Dominican Republic. In Cuba, you won't find that sort of thing. I have yet to see anything. I don't think it actually exists. I don't think outsiders are allowed to actually buy property unless they have some sort of special permit or permission by the government itself to buy property in Cuba. The thing with Dominican resorts that I find is that they're very Americanized. So they do take into consideration what type of things people from North America generally would be looking for. For example, good food, a very modernized looking resort, a very well maintained and well kept resort, things for their children, for example. You find water parks in the Dominican Republic, which you don't find in Cuba, because the resorts have such better funding in the Dominican Republic versus in Cuba generally. You'll find a lot more services are available in the Dominican Republic. Things like I said, like what I mentioned before, was the free Wi-Fi. You know, a lot more amenities inside of your room, things for children, the water parks again, those sort of things. If you're into that sort of stuff and you want basically everything available to you, go to the Dominican Republic. Those types of things you don't find in Cuba. Cuba is a lot simpler. You won't get services that are even comparable to what they do in the Dominican Republic. I find the Dominican Republic is generally very good value. Yes, you may pay more than what you're going to pay in Cuba, but generally your experience, your overall service, the amenities, everything is, you're going to get a lot more in the Dominican Republic, and I find that if you spend the extra money, you're going to enjoy it a little bit more. You also get things like better alcohol selection. They have alcohol in the Dominican Republic from basically anywhere in the world. For example, I'm Canadian, I like Canadian Club whiskey. Canadian Club whiskey you'll find sometimes in the Dominican Republic depending on what resort you actually go to. In Cuba, I've only think that I've seen Canadian Club at one resort. Now, a few cons regarding the Dominican Republic. You can't really go to town. So, for example, if you're in Punta Cana, you generally don't really want to go into the town because it can be dangerous. There are certain parts around the Dominican Republic which some people would consider ghettos or very risky places for tourists, where people may want to steal your belongings, rob you, and God knows what. So you kind of want to stay out of those places. If you go to Puerto Plata, you generally can go to town. It is relatively safe. I remember when we went, we actually ended up going into town and it was perfectly fine. We were escorted, obviously, we had a tour, but generally nobody bothered us, right? In Punta Cana, things are a little bit different. Now that's a huge difference between Dominican Republic and Cuba. When it comes to Cuba, wherever you are, you're safe. The safety factor in Cuba is amazing because you can literally go anywhere across the country and no one will bother you. Especially because the government highly enforces protection for tourists, that the locals are generally fearful of actually doing anything wrong to any tourists. Like, for example, if you're walking down the street and you wanted to sit on a bench and there was a Cuban person sitting on the bench, they would probably get up and offer you the seat. I've been explained to it like that. Now, I've also experienced that myself. When we were in Cuba, we actually made friends with some of the locals, and they literally invited us to their house, they made us dinner, they took us around, you know, the city, and it was amazing, right? It was very easy and simple to do. Whereas in the Dominican, I have yet to really have that experience. Now, there's also this huge problem going around the Caribbean known as the seaweed situation. A lot of areas, especially the beaches in the Dominican Republic, have been noticing that there's been a lot of seaweed that's been coming up onto shore. Now, obviously, it's kind of annoying if you're trying to walk up along the beach and all of a sudden there's this huge pile of seaweed right in your way. Now, generally in the Dominican Republic, one thing you can definitely compare to Cuba are the beaches. The beaches in the Dominican Republic are generally very nice, except for what I found was Santo Domingo and Puerto Plata, the beaches were not as nice. But if you go to Punta Cana, the beaches are definitely beautiful. However, the beaches in the Dominican, not even close to the beaches in Cuba. In Cuba, you find literally that pure white sand. I've been to Varadero and Cayo Santa Maria, and I found both of the beaches there were absolutely incredible. Another thing that you're going to find a lot of in the Dominican Republic is poverty, especially if you go into a lot of little small towns around the area. You're going to find there's a lot of very, very poor families generally. And it is tough to see. I actually personally have a World Vision sponsor, and he's from the Dominican Republic. And if you see where some of these people live, it's devastating, and it'll absolutely break your heart. The water generally in the Dominican Republic is definitely a lot rougher than what you'll find in Cuba. In Cuba, you'll find literally the water is so calm that you barely even see a ripple going through. So one thing that may bother you about the Dominican Republic generally is their sales tactics. So if you're on Bavaro Beach, for example, to the left and to the right of majority of the very popular resorts, they have salespeople. They have little huts where they sell souvenirs, cigars, which don't buy the cigars. The cigars are knockoffs. They are fake. They're not real in any sort of way, no matter how much of a good deal they are. They're not as good as what you're gonna buy from the store, which are the legitimate, actual taxed tobaccos in the Dominican Republic. Now these guys, let me tell you, their sales tactics are very annoying. They will do literally anything to get a sale out of you. Now there is a little bit of trick to these guys. Haggle with them. They will take a smaller value. They always upsell. They try and go with the highest value of something. If something should be sold for $10, they'll probably sell it for 30 or 40. So offer them 5, for example, and let them start going down, you go up a little bit, that sort of thing. The best trick, pretend to walk away. Tell them, oh, don't worry about it, I'm not interested in it anymore. They'll come chasing after you and give it to you for almost whatever it is that you're offering them. Now, onto a little bit more about Cuba. Cuba is definitely one of the more affordable destinations, if not the most affordable destination, because you could literally buy a week vacation for $600 in Cuba. Keep in mind that these resorts are probably not that great. For $600, you're not going to get a whole lot. The food will probably be crappy. The resort probably won't be renovated for a long while. The greatest thing about Cuba, I think, are generally the people. They're very, very happy, they're laid back, they're generally very nice people, whereas the Dominicans are a little bit more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but they're just not as calm as generally Cuban people are. The biggest thing with Cuba, because it's such a cheap destination, there generally are a lot of young people that go and party, and I have to say the partying in Cuba is probably better than it is in the Dominican Republic. For the simple fact that you can actually go downtown to Varadero, for example, and there's a lot of hot spots where people party. They have a lot of festivals, and people can generally have a good time. The cigars, for one, in Cuba are #1 in the world. Everybody knows Cuban cigars are great, and the fact of the matter is, in Cuba, cigars are super cheap. For an actual Romeo and Juliet, a real legitimate Romeo and Juliet cigar, you'll pay about $4.50 US, depending on what size. It can vary anywhere from $3 to maybe $6 or $7, depending on how big the cigar actually is. The rum I find generally to be better in Cuba. I think they're more known for their rum production. They do have very good rum in the Dominican, but I believe that there's a lot more selection you'll find in Cuba, where you have Havana Club, Malibu is originally from there. There's a lot of different companies that make anywhere from low-end to high-end rum, whereas in the Dominican, it's a little bit more basic than that. You'll find Barcelo rum. I think it's Ron Barcelo, I think that's what it's called. In the Dominican, you'll find Brugal is their most common, but it's not as good as a lot of the other brands available in the Dominican Republic. I think the last point to kind of make as a pro for Cuba would be if you like cars. They have a lot of cool old American cars from the 60s and 70s that a lot of people generally like to see. Now keep in mind that a lot of these vehicles, because they've been there for so long and they're so overused, that they're generally not original anymore. Most of them are Frankenstein motors slapped together just to kind of keep the things running. In Cuba, I found that the general expectation of customer service is definitely not as high as the Dominican Republic, but it can also vary depending on which resort you go to. We went to the Melia Varadero last year, and honestly I found the service was just shit. There's no other way to put it. It was awful. People were very grumpy, moody. You'd be standing at the bar trying to order an espresso for over 20 minutes without anybody asking you what you wanted. Versus in the Royalton Hicacos in Varadero, I found the service was a lot faster. I remember we couldn't figure out what the code for the safe was anymore, and we called customer service, and the person was there literally within 3 minutes to unlock the safe for us. That is what I call good service. Generally, you'll find the service in the Dominican generally a lot better overall. I think just their expectation, it has nothing to do with the people generally. I think it's just the expectation of service is just a lot higher in the Dominican, whereas in Cuba they're a lot more laid back. Another downside, for me, I don't really give a shit, but a lot of people would find this a huge con. Other than the Royalton Hicacos, I have yet to see real bacon in any of the resorts in Cuba. In the Dominican, not a problem. Pretty much, I think any resort that we've been to for breakfast, they always had bacon. I know a lot of people love bacon. I don't really care for it that much, but you know what? If you like it, you're probably not going to find it on the lower end resorts in Cuba. Another downside is that they have very little American commercial product. So for example, things like Coca-Cola. They have their own version of Coca-Cola. You generally won't see Coca-Cola in Cuba. I remember walking into a store, I was actually really surprised once walking into a store and I looked in the fridge and they had one single Coca-Cola just sitting there on the shelf. That is something you definitely don't see very often just because they don't really have it imported very much. And that's pretty much it from me, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope a lot of the things that I said may have been very informative and very helpful to help you make a decision. I'm still deciding on where I'm gonna go. I do love Cuba. I love the beaches in Cuba. I think it's a great place to go, but more so on a budget. If you have a little bit higher expectations, you want better food, better service, you'd probably want to pick the Dominican Republic, and that's probably where I'll be going next. Not that I'm ever going to not go to Cuba ever again, but we're just going to save it for a later date, especially when I actually decide I want to go to Havana. Alright guys, that's it for me today. Don't forget to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button so you know whenever I make new videos, and don't forget to hit the little notification bell on the side there as well. You can check out my last video where I picked out some of the coolest places that I plan on going in the future. I'll put that link at the end of this video and at the top right here. Alright guys, thanks a lot. Take care.